Tistale. Every year on 2nd October, the birth anniversary of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi or Mahatma Gandhi is observed with prayers, tributes and services across the world. Gandhi considered nonviolence to be a philosophy, a principle and an experience based on which it is possible to build a better nonviolent society. Incorporating nonviolence as a resistance tool, Gandhi took the forefront of India's freedom struggle against British colonial rule. Raised in a Hindu family in coastal Gujarat's Porbandar, Gandhi's fight for independence, India's independence, fueled the UN General Assembly's decision to adopt 2nd October as the International Day of Nonviolence. Active Nonviolence Education Center is inviting 4 eminent speakers to speak on nonviolence to mark this auspicious occasion.
It's my great honor and pleasure to introduce Rabbi Everett Gendler and Dr. Mary Gendler. Rabbi Gendler was born in Iowa in 1928. He earned a BA from the University of Chicago and was ordained as a conservative rabbi by the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City. In the late 50s and early 60s, he served as a rabbi to a number of congregations throughout Latin America. And then in 1962, he became rabbi at the Jewish Center in Princeton, New Jersey. He was new enough in Princeton that while he was still sleeping on the floor of the congregation house, waiting for his furniture to arrive, he got a call from a friend. That call changed his life. Dr. King is having a lot of trouble down in Albany, Georgia, and would love some help from Northern clergy, he was told. Would you be available? Rabbi Gendler stated, at that point, do you put your feet where your mouth has been, or do you not? So, on the first Friday night he was to have addressed his new congregation in Princeton, he was instead involuntarily housed in the Carroll County Jail with Dr. King. Rabbi Gendler played a pivotal role in involving American Jews in the civil rights movement, leading groups of American rabbis to participate in prayer vigils and protests, not just in Albany, Georgia in 1962, but in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 and in Selma, Alabama in 1965. He was key to persuading Abraham Joshua Heschel to participate in the famous march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. Rabbi Gendler has served on the board of the Jewish Peace Fellowship and currently serves on the board of the Shomer Shalom Institute for Jewish Nonviolence. In 2013, he was honored with a Human Rights Hero Award by the Trua Foundation in recognition of a lifetime of work on behalf of nonviolence, human rights, and the environment. Mary and Everett Gendler met in Kansas City in 1964, where Everett was giving a lecture about his experiences in the civil rights movement. They have spent their subsequent years working together to lead purposeful and meaningful lives. For over 50 years, the Gendlers have been active in the civil rights, peace, religious renewal, and environmental movements, and they have been practitioners and advocates of vegetarianism and organic gardening. Since 1995, they have been involved in the community education work among the Tibetan exiles on strategic nonviolent struggle in Dharamsala, India. And then in 2007, they played a central role in the founding of the Active Nonviolent Education Center at the request of His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama. Dr. Mary Gendler is a force in her own right. She was born in 1940 in Kansas City, Missouri. She earned a bachelor's degree in English from Stanford University, a master's degree in French literature from the University of Kansas, and a doctorate in clinical psychology from Boston University. Dr. Gendler has worked in private practice as a clinical psychologist, run workshops for schools for children of divorced families, and she has served in numerous boards all over the United States. She also has been marching all of her entire adult life, including at Seabrook, New Hampshire against nuclear power, in Selma, Alabama with Dr. Martin Luther King, and for the Equal Rights Amendment and against the Vietnam War in Washington, D.C. Rabbi and Mary, thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to offer a special thanks for your vision for ANEC and for all of the work and support you have put into it over these past many years. Welcome.
Thank you so very much, Karen, for that generous introduction. And it is a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. It seems especially fitting on Gandhi's birthday as we commemorate that luminary, that beacon of understanding and hope for our entire planet. It's appropriate that we spend a few minutes looking at the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in our country, the United States of America, because King himself is quite explicit that Gandhi made it possible for him to function in the way that he did. You know, in a sense, King is our Gandhi, our nationalized version. And he acknowledges in his essay on pilgrimage to nonviolence, he acknowledges this when he talks about having become discouraged by his inability to apply the love ethic of Jesus to social situations. He said, I had almost despaired of the power of love to solve social problems. The turn the other cheek and the love your enemies philosophies are valid, I felt, only when individuals are in conflict with other individuals. When racial groups and nations are in conflict, a more realistic approach is necessary. Then I was introduced to the life and teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. As I read his works, I became deeply fascinated by his campaigns of nonviolent resistance. The whole Gandhian concept of satyagraha, satya is truth, which equals love, and graha is force. Satyagraha thus means truth force or love force, was profoundly significant to me. As I delved deeper into the philosophy of Gandhi, my skepticism concerning the power of love gradually diminished, and I came to see for the first time that the Christian doctrine of love, operating through the Gandhian method of nonviolence, is one of the most potent weapons available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. And additionally, in yet another essay, King mentions again that it was Gandhi who taught him that this desire for love and justice applied to a society could in fact be realized through this method of non-active, non-violent struggle. When it came to applying this, it's instructive to see the terms in which King expressed it. And he says quite specifically, in any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps. First, collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist. Second, negotiation. Third, self-purification. Fourth, direct action. Now, when King was active, it was often and almost always the case that he and those with whom he was working would survey the situation and in ascertaining the facts, discover certain continuing issues that needed to be addressed. We'll give an example of that in a minute. At this point in time, addressing the question of how this might apply to Black Lives Matter, here the situations that arrest attention tend to be abuses that are visible both to protesters but to the entire body politic. And the sight, the visible, evident picture of brutality exerted against fellow human beings of whatever skin color has aroused tremendous mortification and outrage in our society. We should be heartened by the fact that there is this upsurge of conscience in relation to this abuse of power, and thousands of honorable policemen, themselves dedicated to the ideals of law, order with justice, are equally appalled. So we have to find ways in which we work together to address this atrocity. It's not always easy to control the reactions of people, but King, like Gandhi, was profoundly dedicated to being sure that in the expression of outrage, we may clearly distinguish between deed and doer. And both King and Gandhi urged us to attack without mercy, to attack the evil deed, while yet recognizing the humanity of those who inflict such injuries and those who acquiesce in them. Both of them urged us to seek alliances, even with those in opposition, in order to achieve ultimately a broader unification on principles that all human beings can share. Now, King was a master of concreteness, along with flowing rhetoric and uplifting phrases. One example, in every city we have a dual society. This dualism runs in the economic market. In every city we have two economies. In every city we have two housing markets. In every city we have two school systems. This duality has brought about a great deal of injustice, and I don't need to go into all that because we are all familiar with it. In every city, to deal with this unjust dualism, we must constantly work toward the goal of a truly integrated society, while at the same time we enrich the ghetto. We must seek to enrich the ghetto immediately in the sense of improving the housing conditions, improving the schools in the ghetto, improving the economic conditions. At the same time, we must be working to open the housing market so there will be one housing market only, etc. We must work on two levels. We must gradually move to disperse the ghetto and immediately move to improve conditions within the ghetto, which in the final analysis will make it possible to disperse it at a greater rate after a few years from now. This seems so contemporary. It's hard to believe that that was written 40 years ago or more. So King could be concrete, and there was one aspect of his approach that I will mention. I wish there were more time, but there isn't. His focus on self-purification was very important in relation to making sure that the approach was with ultimate reconciliation in mind, not simply the rancor, the anger of the moment. The anger of the moment must be respected, but always there must be the self-searching, the individual scrutiny of our own intentions and our own reactions to these injuries. Most extraordinary, to select just one example, at the conclusion of the successful Montgomery Bus Boycott, when the federal government ruled that the buses must be integrated, there were workshops held throughout Montgomery in every church, and they went on for the 3 or 4 days during which the buses were being prepared for integration. And during that period, there were instructions about how to behave on the bus, be proud but not arrogant, consider the feelings of those. We're not victor and vanquished. We are together celebrants of the triumph of justice and equality. That Gandhian spirit, that biblical spirit of ultimate reconciliation is the benchmark of King's Gandhianism and his contribution to our struggle today. As we're concerned about this quest for justice, resulting in greater splintering of our society, we need to keep in mind that with this sense that we ultimately share the human condition and are bound to one another by a shared divine image, or the special human spirit for those who don't like theological talk. So long as we bear that in mind, there is the possibility of the outrage and the protest with ultimately that reconciliation. One brief final concluding example. In the Southern struggle, I remember my first visit to the Atlanta airport, as I was walking down the corridor, I realized that Andrew Young, a young minister working with King, was at that point in jail. 10 years later, I was in Atlanta for a conference. Walking down that corridor, I realized Andrew Young was now the congressman from that district. And 2 decades later, as I walked down that corridor, I saw, "Welcome to the city of Atlanta, Andrew J. Young, Mayor." Andrew Young would never have been mayor without a substantial white vote by those whom earlier he had contended with ferociously, but always respectfully. If that could happen in the South 50 years ago, something comparable is yet possible for us today, if only we maintain that spirit exemplified by Gandhi and King. Thank you.
Mary, I know you have some wonderful things to add.
Well, I want to talk about one element that is crucially important in any nonviolent campaign, and that is violence. Non-violence means you can have no violence. Now, this is a pretty hard thing for people to accept, because there's been so much violence all around that's sort of understood that that's the way you protest. But it is crucially important that in any nonviolent campaign, there be no violence whatsoever. What the opposition wants is for you to be violent, or a little bit violent, because that gives them the excuse to crack down on you. And this can be seen, for example, with the Tibetans. In 2008, there was an uprising in Lhasa, and some people, we don't know how many, but some burned stores and other acts of violence. And that gave the Chinese every excuse to just come in, wipe them out. You see, they're destroying a city. They're after Chinese. We can repress them as much as we want. And so that is both, and I'm sure in the King campaign, there must have been many teachings about, somebody might say something to you on the bus or nasty or whatever, but you must always maintain nonviolence in that. Now, that's one way that violence can operate in a nonviolence campaign, which is the participants being violent. The other way, which happens really even more often, is your nonviolent campaign can be invaded. People from the outside come in and do violent things, and that can happen both in terms of like setting fires and things. Like we see a lot of that in the Black Lives Matter, but it can also happen for people themselves, and thinking that I just have to be violent. There's just no other way to get around this, and that is a very bad thing to do. So then, what do you do? You're being nonviolent. You're walking along, like I was in Selma, and I looked up, and there was a huge, burly policeman holding on a leash a very vicious, eager-looking dog, and you're walking right past that, and that's terrifying. And what are you going to do with your fear, and how are you going to manage your fear? And that's a very important element. Actually, it's an important element to talk about all the different emotions that are going to get triggered when you're in a nonviolent campaign. But how do you deal with your fear? How do you handle it? I mean, you're looking at this huge dog and, it's really, really frightening. So you have to learn ways to deal with your fear and how you can be close to other people and how you can take deep breaths to sort of calm yourself down and how you can think about something else so that you're not terrified just looking at all of this. So the whole issue of violence and the emotions that it triggers is very, very important. And as I say, it was to Gandhi, who convinced people to just stand in line and get their head cracked open with the salt marsh, which is pretty incredible. And also important with King too. So nonviolence is an excellent way to create change. And you need to know all the different elements and what you're going to be putting yourself into if you agree to be nonviolent.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today, for your experience, for your words of wisdom. It's just been an honor and a pleasure to work on this together with you. And again, I know I've said it before, but I want to thank you both for the foresight and dedication to helping to create ANEC and all of your dedication since its founding in 2007 for everything that you've done on behalf of humanity for nonviolent struggle. Thank you. For many of us who attend the teachings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in the United States, Geshe Thupten Jinpa Longri is a lifeline. I personally have pages and pages of notes filled with his wonderful translations. I am so honored to be able to introduce him today. He was born in Tibet in 1958 and fled with his family to India in 1959. He is a Tibetan Buddhist scholar, having received his Geshe Lam degree from Ganden Monastery, and is a respected academic of religious studies in both Eastern and Western philosophy, with a BA in philosophy and a PhD in religious studies from Cambridge University. Jinpa has been the principal English translator to His Holiness the Dalai Lama since 1985 and has translated and collaborated on numerous books by the Dalai Lama, including the New York Times bestseller Ethics for a New Millennium and The Art of Happiness, as well as Beyond Religion, Ethics for a Whole World. His own publications include A Fearless Heart, How the Courage to be Compassionate Can Transform Our Lives, and translations of major Tibetan works featured in the Library of Tibetan Classics series. Thupten Jinpa is the founder and chairman of the Compassion Institute and the principal author of Compassion Cultivation Training, also known as CCT, the Institute's flagship compassion education offering. A frequent speaker at various international conferences on mindfulness and compassion and contemplative practice, Jinpa also serves as an adjunct professor of religious studies at McGill University, Montreal, and is the founder and president of the Institute of Tibetan Classics. He has been a core member of the Mind and Life Institute and its chairman of the board since 2012. The fuel behind all of his work is compassion. While preparing for this introduction, I found a wonderful article with a quote from Jinpa La that I felt was so helpful and hopeful at this time. Compassion turns out to be the common ground where the ethical teachings of all major traditions, religious and humanistic, come together. Even in the contested political arena, compassion is one value that both sides of the spectrum are eager to claim. Jinpa La, thank you so much for being part of this special event today and for joining us. Welcome.
It's both an honor and also a joy to be part of this special event being organized by Active Nonviolent Education Center, which is based in Dharamsala. The concept of active nonviolence is something that really needs to be shared and appreciated more widely in today's time. I've had the privilege to serve His Holiness as his principal interpreter for over 35 years now. And one thing that I recognize about His Holiness's approach to, global problems as well as national problems as well as societal problems. Of course, his signature approach is really to bring nonviolence in a most robust way. And his concept of nonviolence is not a sort of a pacifist approach where your main emphasis is for people to just um, accept what is going on. In fact, there is a beautiful expression that he often brings up, which really sums up this powerful concept of active nonviolence. And he puts it in a very simple way. He says that prayer is not enough. We need action. And that statement really captures the core of the idea that is being conveyed by this idea of active nonviolence. And I think it's really important for organizations like ANEC, Active Nonviolence Education Center, to really bring this concept more widely. And particularly in our time when the world is beginning to look more confused. And part of the confusion that we're experiencing today is in some ways sort of part of the birthing pains of a changed world, where we are slowly beginning to adjust to the fundamental shifts that have taken place in the world as a result of globalization. And as world becomes more integrated, as people come into contact with each other, we cannot avoid in any part of the world the basic question of how do I treat the other person in front of me who looks different from me, who holds a different opinion, who has a different worldview. So there is the globalization of the world, and part of that has come through global market system, open borders with tourism, exchange of people across, exchange of ideas, and then of course technology, particularly the digital technology, has really made the world truly integrated, whether we like it or not. And this is why His Holiness, for a long time, often emphasized the need to adjust to the new reality of our world. So in this situation, in one of His Holiness's later books, this is in Towards the True Kinship of Faith, people haven't really noticed that point powerfully, but His Holiness says early on in the book that one of the greatest challenges of 21st century is really the need on the part of every single society to find a way to have a truly peaceful coexistence with other people. And that really is a fundamental challenge of our time. So now, when this happens, of course, through the globalization, there is going to be a reaction for people to retreat back in, to seek comforts in tribalization, tribalism, nationalism, America first, or whatever it is, whatever form it takes. So that's one way, but that approach is a kind of a denial of the reality of our world. So the most skillful and smart to the changing reality, and one of the awareness, particularly through the climate crisis, that many of the problems that we face require a collective joint effort. No single nation can solve these problems. So in these kind of situations, what is required is some new way of dealing with problems. And this is where active nonviolence comes. And particularly today right now, because of the certain societal situations in America, there is a lot of movement on the part of ordinary people calling for more social justice, really bringing awareness to the institutional biases and inequities that really contribute to the pain of so many sectors, specific sectors of the society. So in these situations, the social justice movement is really taking on the younger generation. I'm a father of two young daughters, and their heart is really in social justice. So social justice has really taken on and really captivated the inspiration and inspired the younger generation who are in their early 20s, mid 20s, and early 30s. So we have an amazing opportunity to really seize on this movement, very particular point in history, when there is this powerful movement, particularly among the young. And here, I think centers like Active Nonviolence, Education Center could play a powerful role, because what is needed is for this powerful, emotional focus and inspiration and movement driven by social justice to be wedded with deep rooted appreciation of compassion that unites all of us, a recognition of common humanity. So what is needed is a way of approach where compassion becomes the bedrock on which the younger generation built up their social justice activism. Because otherwise, if social justice activism is divorced from compassion, then it can lead to violence. Because social justice movement, regardless of how important, noble the motivation may be, if it is divorced from compassion, then your tendency is to demonize the other. Your tendency is to dehumanize the other. Your tendency is to bring intolerance to the disagreeing perspective. And so this is where I think His Holiness's teachings are really going to be so important, because His Holiness spent his entire life, including his leadership of the Tibetan freedom struggle, by steadfastly believing in the power of nonviolence. And he often reminds us that nonviolence may not give us a quick solution. A violent approach may give us a quick solution, but the solution that is arrived at through violence often leads to more violence, because it creates basis for resentment that linger on for generations. And we see that in the Middle East. We see that in many different parts of the world. Whereas once a solution is found through steadfast, non-violent, compassionate approach, which really we may completely disagree with the perspective the other side is adopting, but we can arrive at a shared ground where at least we recognize that perspective that the other side is adopting ultimately is coming from some aspiration to create a better world, at least from their point of view. So I think this ability opens up to be able to at least see the other side if we take compassion seriously. So I think here there's a lot of resource in His Holiness, particularly his two books, Ethics for the New Millennium and Beyond Religion, that really, helps us, bring that robustness, this active component to the nonviolent approach. So the nonviolent approach is not pure activism. It is an activism that is grounded in genuine concern and welfare for broader humanity and a specific cause. And so that compassion brings clarity to your action. And also one of the powerful things about compassion is that if you have broader perspective of compassion and bedrock sort of support of it, then there's less danger of disillusionment and becoming burnout. Because often what happens is that when activism is detached from compassion, then a short-termism comes in. And then the short-termism really makes your commitment to the cause contingent upon whether it can be achieved within a certain period of time. And His Holiness often reminds us, if the cause is noble, it should not matter whether you see its result in your lifetime. That may be quite a lot to ask for a lot of people, but I think there is a powerful insight there, because what matters to you, if you are a genuinely compassionately motivated, nonviolent social justice activist, then what matters in the end is the actual cause, the realization of that goal. And then not only that, but also realization of the goal in a way that does not cause too much pain on others. So those are the principal ideas of nonviolence. And so I think this concept of active nonviolence is an important one, because sometimes nonviolence is associated as being passive. associated as, if someone hits you on the head, there is in fact injunctions in the Holy Scriptures where if you turn the left cheek. And similarly in Buddhist texts, there are instructions on, viewing your enemy as your spiritual teacher and so on. Yes, for some individuals, those are powerful teachings. But in principle, adopting nonviolence doesn't mean letting the other side do what they want. You can, and sometimes people think that sense of outrage is also incompatible with compassion. That's not true. Some of the most compassionate movements led by powerful, compassionate people like Mandela and Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi and His Holiness in our generation, in our lifetime, their movements are all motivated by a sense of outrage, a moral outrage at the injustice. And that is a constructive, because without that kind of moral outrage, you're not going to have the power of that emotional commitment to the cause. So I think you do need to have that. And so for those who are on the teaching side of nonviolence movement, it's very important to make sure that whatever you do does not dampen the energy of the youth, where there is a powerful sense of outrage at the current injustices that are built into the system itself. So, I think it's important. So the finding that balance of bedrock of compassion, yet in the form of the actual movement, not undermining that energy that sense of outrage brings. So I think that keeping that balance, it's a kind of a dance. And once you are able to do that, the movements can be powerful. Not only will the goal of these movements be noble, but actually the method by which, the way by which you, and very noble. And that, in a sense, is the ideal of active nonviolence. So, I mean, nonviolence movement has a long, noble tradition, going all the way back at least in the Indian and Tibetan tradition to the Buddha, 2,500 years ago, more than 2,500 years ago, with Mahavir, one of the great figures of Jain tradition. And so in history, human history, there have been always proponents of violent solutions to human problem and non-violent solutions to human problem. That has always been the case. In our time, we don't really have the luxury to try out that violence approach because the means of destruction that is at our human disposals are unimaginable. In the old days, it's spears and sticks and swords and arrows. But in our time, we have weapons of mass destruction. So we really don't have the luxury to try out the violent approach, which then leaves only the non-violent approach. But then if we leave just a non-violent approach, then it can open up abusive systems where we don't have a means to oppose. And this is where, mass movements of non-violent social justice action becomes the key. And, Mahatma Gandhi is the one, His Holiness often reminds us, who actually translated the teachings of non-violence into political movement, into action. And Martin Luther King was inspired by this. Nelson Mandela adopted it, and His Holiness has adopted this in relation to the Tibetan freedom struggle. So I think there is already a noble tradition, and the younger generation, particularly, we really need to find a way to inspire them, encourage them, and educate them. And so I would like to take this opportunity to express my own personal admiration to the Active Nonviolence Education Center, and for inviting me to this, Karen, to you, and Ketsala, who invited me to be part of this. And thank you so much.
Thank you so very much for your words of wisdom. They're so helpful and so inspiring and instructive. Again, thank you so much for joining us. It was such an honor to have you with us.
Sri Rajiv Vora has been unable to send his message due to some personal reasons. Therefore, we have invited Dr. Tridip Surit, Provost at CEPT University, Ahmedabad, to speak on the same topic, Gandhi and his nonviolent struggle against British colonial rule.
Gandhiji very often spoke of ahimsa, non-violence, as kala, as art. And if we were to meditate upon this phrase, if we were to think of the implications of what it is to practice non-violence as an art form, we would begin to understand something of his notion of both non-violence and of satyagraha. Those of us who have either been practicing an art form or at least listening to them, viewing them, realize that it is something that anybody can acquire. It is something that comes to us through practice, meditative practice, a practice upon which we reflect. And therefore, what Gandhi wants us to understand is that ahimsa is not a special gift that he had. Satyagraha was not something that was available only to him. It was available to all of us if we were to do the sadhana for it. If we were to do work as an apprentice with a teacher, if we were to work on our own, make it part of our self-practice, a part of our daily ritual, that we could cultivate the understanding of both non-violence and therefore begin to understand the implications of satyagraha. Satyagraha, as we understand, is composed of two words, satya, truth, and agraha, insistence upon. So it's the insistence upon truth that creates the idea of satyagraha. But the idea of satyagraha requires us to do two things. It is first and foremost an insistence upon truth. And truth can elude anyone. It can elude all of us. Also, that is available in equal measure to everyone. So it is not my truth that Gandhi speaks of. It is not his truth that he speaks of. It is also the truth that is available to the opponent. And therefore, satyagraha is a practice which is first and foremost about truth. And how does one arrive at that truth? And therefore, Gandhi would say, we arrive at truth only through a dialogic practice. It's only through the conversation with others, including those that we seek to oppose or those who wish to oppress us, that we begin to understand what is this idea of truth that we are trying to fight upon. That's one. It also is predicated upon another practice, and which is an ancient practice. All great teachers have taught us this practice, which is that all of us are capable of feeling the pain of others, which is what Gandhi spoke of when he cited this famous hymn from the poet, medieval Gujarati poet Narsimha Mehta, which says, it is our capacity to recognize the pain and suffering of others that makes us a good person, a good Hindu, a good Christian, a good Buddhist, or just a simple good human being. It does not require an idea of religion with it, but the capacity to understand the suffering of others, to understand what violation of a person's body, violation of person's culture does, is required for us to be fully human. Now, this fact that we are capable of recognizing the pain of others is true not only for us. Gandhi argues that it is true for everyone, including an oppressor. Be that oppressor be a government, be an empire, be an individual, or a structure. Unless and until we grant the other the capacity to recognize our pain and suffering, satyagraha is not possible. Because satyagraha requires an assumption. And the assumption is that when I undergo pain and suffering for sake of truth, when I undergo privations, when I undergo even very long suffering, as the people of Tibet have been undergoing, it requires a belief and a faith that at some point everyone is capable of recognizing pain, suffering, truth, and acting upon it, without which satyagraha is not possible. And therefore, the beauty of satyagraha is that it understands and it requires that we, as people offering satyagraha, recognize the humanity of our oppressor. And people would say, what is this idea? Is somebody an empire, a state, to be human? But if you take away their humanity, what you are also taking away from there is their capacity to understand and appreciate your suffering, your pain, your privation, your struggle. And that sense, Satyagraha is an affirmation of faith. Satyagraha is an affirmation of faith in the humanity of the most oppressive regime that we can think of. And that's important for us to recognize. And therefore, Satyagraha is a dialogue. It's a dialogue about the possibility of being human. It's a dialogue about possibility of creating an understanding that is shared about pain, suffering, and through that, truth. And that's why Satyagraha is such a very beautiful idea. And that's why Gandhi would say Satyagraha is an art form. It is an art form because it is entirely human. Only human beings, and human beings who are capable of self-awareness, reflection, constant practice, are capable of offering Satyagraha. We might ask, is it possible to offer a Satyagraha against a tyrant? And Gandhi's answer was, yes, it is possible to offer Satyagraha against a tyrant. Because the moment we deny the tyrant his or her humanity, what we are doing is robbing ourselves of the possibility of Satyagraha. It is necessary for us as people undergoing suffering, people whose rights have been denied, historically, culturally, politically, economically, that we find ourselves on the margins, that we find ourselves the oppressed. Even for the oppressed to recognize the oppressor's humanity is the real heart of Satyagraha. And therefore, Gandhi says, and he uses a very beautiful Gujarati word, he says Satyagraha is a sarvadhari talwar. It is a sword which has an edge on both sides, but it's also is a sword that can be wielded by anyone, by a child, by a man, by a woman, a person who's young, or a person who was once young. All of us are capable of wielding this means of Satyagraha. It is also redemptive. It is redemptive in the sense that it redeems both those who oppress and those who are oppressed. So through Satyagraha, Gandhi hopes to create a universe of freedom. And it is this idea of universal freedom that is something that I wish to foreground. And that is something that has been foregrounded by the struggle of people of Tibet, both in India, in Tibet, and elsewhere. It has been a demand and a fight that seems never ending. But all struggles of truth and justice are long durée. It requires immense patience and generations of suffering for us to be able to change hearts and minds of people and also make what seems to be inhuman structures, which seems to be machine-like structures of efficiency, of oppression, to change. It is also the struggle, like all struggles of freedom, is predicated upon hope. It is predicated upon the belief that it is possible to change even the most dehumanized and dehumanizing political structures. I hope that we can all continue to learn from the teachings of Gandhi, and the only way we can learn is by learning to practice. It is not a practice of imitation. We have to improvise We have to create our own forms of satyagraha, we have to create our own forms of dialogue, and we have to create our own forms of freedom. Thank you and namaste.
Mr. Tenzin Sundula was born in India, did his schooling in Patlikul, and later went on to study in universities in Chennai and Mumbai. He is a well-known poet, writer, and Tibetan activist. His writings have been published in various publications and in various languages across the world. We thank Mr. Tenzin Sundula for accepting our request. Mr. Tenzin Sundula is going to speak on important nonviolent actions by Tibetan community that have positively impacted Tibet and its people. Lessons from the history of Tibetan struggle, nonviolent action inside Tibet contrasted with active nonviolence of the exile community.
다 단단한 좀 비배 탑수기 네버 가와직 레이어스나 내가 갖고 휴지 드레질이야 밥대요래 단대 내가블라 갸나게 깨지능로야 총대기 돈네 찹식인 대박이 돈네 단대 내가블라 간주 벼랑진 라바이나 갑조 체다 파샤 우멜람 균에 릉시랑균 제제 개미님도 대기 랍네 다동 슝대 ngöne ngö수 되벽에 갑조 칭이 제요 말해 지선 두주 딘대직리야 딱 먼저 탑주디 냐자 간데 쳐오래 탑주 간데 진바이네 또 풍경 정보리야 아니 탑주디 경경 제야당 안 레바 무투제 장애라 아니 탑시 나무라 망부지 지요 제가 드린 건조다 시베 람기 균에 베베 탑주 나라 가수지기 시베 따와 단 시베 락링게 돈에 베베 탑주는 가수지기 팬토도 딘데치콜이야 내주 큐브지기 슌데충 당만조 당부 통만 고속되네 배나 지금 이제 십시행아 가자 십시행을이야 아니 계지낭다 단다 막쟁이바 죽디레 십시둘라 야가랑제 톱레 십시둘라 벽이 꾸접제제 야가난리야 아니 랑진데 계급 에시아 낭로네 수연도 딘데가 초진지난리야 벽이 꾸접제제 아니 총두난게 냠슈셔도 딘데 총여레데 십시둘라 야가랑제 톱레 십시골이 개미 변한 전주체연도 납주 로라 단도 참도마셔가 갑라 게지나리야 가수정아 저 지게 갑조 슈베네 수강게 갑조 지게 노인바지 팬토하지 수강 때 말에 야임바이네레 아리 디마임베 잉글랜드 아니 냠데게죠 지금 십시앙을 쇠사레데 지금 저 십시공 납주로 게미 표현하는 체베 갑라야 수강게 지게 무슨 도부지제 잡죠 수강 중요 말에 지선 두주 딘데 질레비 연데 아니 감주 가지글이야 두든 든든주비 샤이도 가서 내당 갖고 쉬지 차대야 지선 먼저 고속도네 내당 딘데신을 내대야 아니 디 내당디 단다 임베네 니도 니슐레베네 쉬우지 유아직 태요 말에 다 단다 니도 니슈기 다 야나 우한네 템베 야네디 게지나로리 차바네 제니 다 게지나로리아 가르무스 되고지 통구도서나 야나 슝기 나로리아 배상 체니 수수 슝 무티제 우주겹네 네 도비에 체도 미만리아 고고요와당 아니 디기 미만 고고요제 수수 슝기 왕 무티제 심투비에 탑시 제단디 게지나로 다란 체브와 야나 나로리아 나자디 각동 체르데 우한네 네버 아니 유럽도 아메리카를 동행도들이야 가동자원이 매매 제제 땅버지 다도 나자 요 말이슬라비 디기 겜베 아니 게지나 타버와 지난 니 돈에 야나기 마위 혹시 제가 니 겜베 다 점블링 표 용려야 직다 단다부도 중원용백이 내양 캡충부시우지 중거로 니 돈에 다 가려 용무스나 게지나로리아 단다부도 시진핑의 모티브 슝디기 딘데지게 담보직 지기요와다 마위시기요와디 게진 남기 첩시베 마시마 말에 신기요레데 다 단ong 무수되고 가르자스는 딘데기 마위시에체 아니 야나 낭로려야 경군 중보다 게진 낭로려 경군 중보디 카세 팅세 세우 쉬우지 샤부송자 다 아리타 오스트레일리아 일본 자가 능시 다 기급든주 동독 제고웨기 랑조 사와직 승고베 내단 딘데직 차요레 다 네 돈에 당도 그급 사업 치면 지당 가지고다 지금 시외 탑람기 돈에 가지고 직다 라원 탑주 세배 값라 갑교 매배 값라 야 탑식 간디 채우고도 아니 다 갑교 매배 맞에 개민염도 초도 제제 별 개민 차시 레시제 당도랑제 랍데베 값래 가지고 탑식 간디 채우고도 다 단다 계지 나로네 개민 견주 제시바다 아니 개민 개나 교용 아니 칼라오래 술비 세베게 두주 딘데지나야 아주 그급 사와 간지 중고도 다들 무쇠 되고 통인 것도 이는 제 님선자 만주다 지금 배배 탑주 낭로리야 지금 압주 만두라 자르무제 랭게 미 니게지기 자나 진짜 계시야 디에 탑시 찍래 디네 양 개미기 자나 별 낭로리야 타직도 타고 짐시 담 미세 제제다 르네사제다 내도 중백갑라 아니 저게 먼저 계진낭로리야 슈두게게 탑시 딘데 제요래 단다 전주 슝 소바 다랑 시베 탑람 낭로네 지금 낭 고지게 던 후디게기 탑시 상슈직 다 전주 슝축제 니기 수수 아니 슝츠 수바 마제 지금 베베 탑주디 아니 낭콩네 후디고 용해 디 기타 자와직 전주 슝 차수부 수마제 리망주 람질 되투베 딘디 강리야 가르무치는 시다 지기 점리 수강리야 매백 우디 딘디지기 시외 탑람라 네번예바 이제 요바 아니 딘데다네 아니 미망고랑 탑람 디낭리 안도투베 딘데 중요해 다 딜레도 양어 베베 탑전낭로리야 지기 람셔바 짱니는 맞아 딘데 말에 딩월이야 주식안디고 토네 탑주 제요래 주정으로 맞아 뭐니 개민님도 고개 제일이야 지기다 수수 속교배다 수수 미망교배 제도 팀만다 깨지 마 갑이래 아니 디다 배나 둔직 둔이 딘데포도 침벌이 둔실 아니 신에다 배나 탄다 주식안두기다 죽마 티베 갑래야 무상 마 디에 둔지신 죽디요래 다 지당 아주 탄다 시베 탑람 체메 시베 시제 라베 갑래야 지당 아주 따발랑 저거 돈에 직 대직게 아주 고내게 따고 직도 아주 가주인나야 아니 체메시베 탑람 직 랍데거 체메시베 탑람 랍에캅리야 디 탑람디 상기살에 온 거에기 람디레 체와 타직 자원이네 맞제바 마용에 랑기 토네 아니 시벨람 지제 딘디즈레거 디 람디 침바이나 미규디다 타마 아니 상기 고방 로트위에기 탑람 디 딘디즈레 소테샤야 다 만주도 차샤는 배는 가도지는 상기 고금 딘데 레와가로 지기메로 만주 나란주 수수 계급 잠린 디날이야 무도제 네베 갑라 아니 라왕기 토네 란징기 토네 네트베 탑시 딘데 지갑라 아니 지금 직수부 라고에 딘데 용식이래 개미 게다 메르당 고에 딘데 용식이래 이네 미규디 계급 란제 소야래 디 토네 지금 셴발이야 디스 마가와 딘데 용식이래 때 마가와 마중나 양 파조 이베네 삼로 요 마데기 년가 딘데 요래 니 무슨 아니 딘데 토네 간주 라베라야 체메시와 말라베체 시벨람 시제 랍고에 딘닝가 좀 보래샤 그 식수부 라보가 당 저베기 토네 딘데 중요베이네 미국 저버디 다 시벨람 유네 수수 계급다 아니 신배 계급 되나리아 라완다 망조 니제 용투베게 배전딘데 시기요래 니 무슨 아주 다 탑람 그 토네 세정국의 제요래 곰드 제요래 와 아니 직 탑람 망부 제요래 니 나로네 다 단다 니동 게나리아 다 변화 사지 지외 뭐그 중요한데 다 표현 용 중요한데 직내 고득이래 니네 거기 나 변한기 망기 지게 다 라왕기 레바주체 아니 ngogo kembeche 속로단치니 제야 디에다 생수템베레 다디 게주 gebdu gebge gegu kubju kosum dinanglo phena ngogo chebe di기 다 람뜨버디 다 무두지네베 딘데레 다디 단다 phena 딘데게 다 ngogo kembe 말랑버마도 니남 무두제 지게 레바직 미망 라에 요베기 네법직 유여브레 다 임베네 단다 니동 गुने माची बिनाता रंगलु में से चुंगयो रंगलु में से दिए चावेता छोजो तोने तादा मंडो जिंगुरे दे इने रामान 탑주 쟁에기 람디나 때비나 디 마레 다슬라 타치구 시베 람딘데 지레 임바 마제 수수 속당제 아니 퍼르볼이야 퍼르브 삼로고로 유바당에 삼로 유바당에 심벌로 수게기 탑람 딘데 짐보 송상 디 기토네 페베 탑주 균경 제야 미만 심슈 파리야 니바 파조기 섬로 셈블 숙투비에기 딘데기 탑람 딘데지레 수수인바이나 수수 빙게지게 안장르메세 딘데나리아 친송 콘돌리아 구지 임바이네 따지게 지금 되발이야 다 딘데 제 먹어봐체 아니 람 딘데지나리아 람 그래 다 태거 지금 조명 토네레 안 오구 gem벽은 토네레 아니 야나 남로리야 아니 유버지 태제 아니 별라 라와 랑젠 톱투베기 딘데 레버지 중나 섬에 디 먼참기 되버 딘데지 요레 디무손자 다 단데네갑려야 다 야나 낭리야 단데네갑려 다 야나 낭라 미망기 다 망조다 라와 되기 요레 딘데리야 다 마저 페베 탑조 응외네 잡조 체투비에 안 딤마제 냥엔디 아니 페베치고 말에 샤르토키선 소코낭소 홍콩 태베 망부지 냥데요 딤마제 야나기 따지게 디그구사 베트남 디네 필리핀스 말레이시아 안 딘데기 러시아 에시아 계급 나로 망부지글야 디그구지 돼요 그래서 단대 야나 시진핑 고티베 슝디기 야나 나로리아 망조다라고 매바 마제 버나로 년을 슈슈셔 마제 전주집에 계급 당 아니 계급 망부직리 찌직 진난 디르구베 내단 딘디직 차대요 아니 락바도 라완 시대된베 계급 자가도지 메네 다 선점 주지 딘데 니지 고고요 님송자 다 되벌 야나 나로리아 지금 망조다 라왕기 토는 개랑 중체 야나랑 아니 라왕기 젠도 줄투비야 망조 계급적 줄투비야 디마제 표다 아니 샤르투구스탄 소고낭소 개미기 전준체고 군조 계급 된조 낭로레 안 장전차제 라왕낭리아 네투비기 레버디 만삼에기 장투고요 디무송자 다 망고지 후직체 아니 내가 최고야 딘데 내법지 레삼고도 디무송자 시베 균네 시베 탑람기 균네 아니 망주 주투비에 장와 주투비에 아니 락바도 벽기급 장와랑제 용투비에 딘데기 레바정기요레 아니 탑람델라 다 슝미마 아니 야르무치 우티베 지게 탑주 낭로리야 참행염슈시에 휴지 개진보레 디 침바이나 안 텐데 시정염 좀 용투비에기 레바딘디지 무수 주투게 레삼고도